Thank you so much for joining our Workbench Masterclass today. My name is Kira Colburn. I'm head of platform at Workbench. And for those of you who are new to Workbench, we're an enterprise software VC based here in New York. We're a $125 million fund and lead seed rounds in enterprise startups throughout the country, including companies you've probably heard of before, like Cockroach Labs, Spring Health, Catalyst, Fire Hydrant, Arthur, and many more. And most of our team actually hails from larger enterprises. So we've seen the inner workings of the go-to-market process, and it's really the number one thing we work on with our founders pretty much all day, every day. So figuring out, your first 3 design partners, that first 250K in enterprise sales and more. And that's why we really launched this masterclass series with founders, operators, and execs to share their most tactical playbooks. So we go a little bit below the high-level strategies and get even deeper into those nitty-gritty tactics on how to. And today's session is inspired by many, many years of conversations with founders about pricing. And the reality is that pricing tends to be, you start somewhere, then you kind of price higher, then price higher, and it's really kind of a guessing game. But that's why we're so thrilled to have Rob Bailey here with us today. He's the former COO and go-to-market lead of Customer, which was acquired by Facebook for $1 billion. He's also the previous CEO of DataShift, which was acquired by Meltwater and Backbone AI. And now he's an advisor to many early stage companies. And Rob knows what it means to price, and he knows what it means to price well. So he'll be sharing his proven framework for approaching pricing and has a number of real world examples to share as well. But most importantly, we want this to be super, super interactive. So please put any questions, comments, anything in the chat as Rob goes through his slides, and we will have plenty of time to discuss it either, at that slide or at the end. And with that, Rob, I think I can hand it over to you to start sharing.
Awesome. Kara, thank you so much. I'm going to have an awkward moment here where we switch over to everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Kira, thank you so much for having me here today, and thanks to Workbench. I've been in New York now almost 10 years, which means I'm almost a true New Yorker. And during that time, Workbench has really been an important and great part of my trip and journey as a founder here in New York. I've been to their events. I've gotten great advice from several partners at Workbench. And at one point when I was starting a crypto fund back in 2017, Jonathan Lair was actually kind enough to let me work from their offices for a few weeks. So deeply grateful for Workbench, for what they do for the community and for the part that they've had in my community. So they asked me to talk about pricing today, which I thought was going to be more of a general discussion. But I was lucky enough to read some of the advertising ahead of the event, and I noticed that I was supposed to talk about a framework. So I retooled my slides to put them in more of a framework kind of perspective, and that's what we'll be talking about here today. I'd also like to just do a real quick welcome to some folks on this Zoom that I've worked with before. Diego, who I'll be mentioning later in the presentation, and Gus Bathis from Cogito, an absolutely incredible team that is a great partner for especially early stage companies building stuff, as well as later stage companies looking to augment their teams. Anyway, real quick about me, and we'll keep this short. Recent development, as of about 6 weeks ago, am the COO and co-founder at Crew AI. We're an orchestration platform for AI agents. It's been an incredible ride so far. Previously did Backbone, Customer, and DataShift. I'm going to kind of go into talking about pricing today. I'd love for this to be as interactive as possible. And so between Kira and I, we're going to do our best to keep track of comments in the chat. But please ask as many questions, interrupt, do whatever you can. This session is really meant to add value for all of you. And so the more questions you ask, the more value you'll get from it. So why pricing? I would say that there are so many things that founders spend a lot of time on in the early stage development of a company, especially at seed stage. Naming, domain, product roadmap, PMF. But there's one thing in particular that people don't spend that much time talking about, but that can actually have a massive impact on a company's future, and that's pricing. I actually don't, I think there's probably few areas of scaling a company where the amount of time spent can have such a big impact on how the company makes money, gross margins, your ability to raise follow-on rounds, et cetera. So what I'm going to be talking about today is, I guess you could kind of call it a framework, but it's really, I kind of want to focus it around 10 kind of big lessons that I've learned over the course of helping different companies or leading several companies that have kind of really nailed pricing. All right, so the first place to start, I know that it's really tempting in the early stages of a company's evolution to want to immediately get into setting up pricing pages. But what I've actually found is one of the biggest mistakes that companies make is to not stop and really think about where they are in the marketplace and where their market is. So that'll actually form a very different foundation for how you think about pricing. It's a terribly cheesy metaphor, but also kind of useful. And that's the difference between red ocean, blue ocean, which is what this graphic shows. And the pricing strategies that you're going to use if the market is more of a red ocean, crowded market with lots of competitors, is typically going to be very different than a market that is kind of open. And I guess as the metaphor calls it, blue water. I've done both. And the good news is you can actually build awesome companies doing both. But the process for pricing can sometimes be a little bit different. What I found, put simply, on the red ocean side of things is if you're going into a market that is already highly competitive, there's actually some things that are really awesome about it, including the fact that there's usually a ton of budget that's allocated. So you don't need to convince people about the merits of the product category or spend. There's usually spend allocated to whatever you're trying to build. The two best ways to penetrate the market are either have a product that is incredible and awesome. That's what we did at Customer, where we had a platform that completely rethought how support teams operated. You can also do it by going cheaper, but I can tell you that VCs really do not like cheaper. They much prefer better value and even premium products into a crowded market. You can go into a blue ocean market as well, obviously, especially we're seeing that a lot in AI right now. That brings with it its own opportunities, less competition, probably lower thresholds for what people expect from your product, but also some challenges, which you have to spend a lot more time actually building out things like business cases and ROI models and everything like that, but they're a little bit different. Lesson number two. For those of you on this call, on the Zoom, that have worked with me before in early stage companies, you probably heard me say, use the term tune-us. I kind of look at customers really in kind of three categories. Nothing unique about this. Lots of people do this. Whales, tunas, and minnows. And who you're selling to and what the buying process is for all of them is very different. And that can mean very different things for pricing. What I have typically found is to use kind of a term from that HBO show, Silicon Valley, middle out. And what I mean by that is you evolve over time, and especially in the early stages of a company, even if you think you're ultimately going to be a top-down enterprise company, selling to some minnows, some small companies, say under 10 employees, can actually be really helpful because of the velocity of learning. And so when I am scaling a company, when we think about pricing, we typically optimize our pricing for very short-term, immediately minnows. And then as you start to scale, you really focus on tunas. Tunas are great because they're bigger, so sort of like mid-sized companies, but they move really fast. And then lastly, whales, which are obviously bigger companies, typically Fortune 500s. Let's call it, the threshold can vary, but over 1,000, 5,000, or 10,000 employees. Pricing for the three different types is very different, even for the same product. And it's a very different buying process. Obviously, there's a lot of money in whales, but they move really slow. Minnows move really quickly, but there's not a lot of money in them long term. So I like to focus on tunas, call it the middle, and hence the middle out idea. So typically when I'm scaling companies, and I've done this a bunch of times, is when we launch a product, we'll go into minnows first to really get that accelerated learning, and in parallel start to close tunas, and then shift into tunas. And from day one, start to think about whales, because whales take forever to close. This is a strategy that we're currently doing with Crew AI. When I started about 6 weeks ago, most of the initial conversations we had were actually with whales, so sort of bigger companies. And in the time it's taken to close a bunch of minnows and tunas, we are just getting through the vendor approval process with a bunch of whales. So you have to start on day one with whales just because it takes so darn long to actually activate. They all mean different in terms of pricing. I would say that minnows, you want low price, make it easy for them to get started. Tunas are again where you're going to make your money and where you probably want to optimize for. And whales typically have very different pricing. And I think the short answer is they really value different things than minnows. So they'll value things like compliance, data security, and in particular, services. Competitor pricing. This is another thing that I think I found that a lot of times early stage founders don't spend a lot of time on. And that is because they just want to focus on their own pricing. But we spent quite a bit of time, at each company that I've scaled, kind of looking at the pricing for different competitors. I'll definitely say that this is a lot more relevant for red ocean situations where there's a lot of competitors. And typically customers will have opinions about that pricing. Blue ocean, probably less likely. But I think that if you study competition, I've certainly found if you study competition, you can actually see some really big opportunities. So this is an example from Zendesk. In the early days of Customer, we spent time talking to customers. I think in the first 9 months that I was with Customer, I think we talked to 700 or 800 customers in the process of formulating our strategy and where we were going to focus on. And one of the things we kept hearing again and again was how much people hated Zendesk pricing. Zendesk is a great company and they've continued to do really well in the support software space, but there were some things that customers didn't like about Zendesk, and one of them was pricing. It was complicated with a lot of hidden back-end costs. So we capitalized on that. And when we launched, we focused on just a few product tiers and extremely simple pricing with no hidden costs. And that really enabled us to do really, really well when we were doing head-to-heads with Zendesk in the early days. So I'm going to do an awkward pause here. Kira, I can't see for some reason if there's any comments yet in the chat. Do we have any questions yet?
Yeah, we have someone, this is probably for the last page, but what employee count would you define for each of those buckets, like the minnows, the tunas, the whales, and what pricing range for each bucket? So you might get into that later in the webinar, but just wanted to check if that's a good place to chat.
Oh, that's a great question, and I don't think I do, so I will cover it now. I will say it really depends. I would say go talk to, in the early days of getting started. I know this is a presentation about pricing, but I would say that the most important thing that you're optimizing for, and this is not any idea I've come up with, this is what a lot of other sort of people smarter than me have said on Twitter, you're optimizing for learning, and the faster you learn, the better you'll do. So I recommend that founders go talk to as many customers as possible, and I have some hacks for how you can do that. And you'll kind of start to feel, after you've talked to a few hundred customers, you'll start to feel how they settle out. I would say in the case of Crew AI, for now, we'll typically say that minnows are typically, say, under 10 employees. We do also have a lot of sort of single individual developers. And then tunas will typically go, for now, tunas will go kind of, I would say, 10 to maybe 100 or 200 people. And then whales after that. I know this is going to sound confusing, but the definition of what a tuna and a whale is, relatively speaking, will typically go up in threshold over the course of the company. So basically, as you scale and as you get more customers, what is considered a whale will change over time. In the early days of customer, I remember doing high fives with Brad and Jeremy when we would close a, $1,000 a month customer, which sort of felt like a whale to us. And I think by now, I would think that that's probably considered almost like a minnow for customers. So I think it definitely changes. To further complicate things, I would also say that sometimes you'll have um, whales that act like minnows. And I know it sounds really, really silly, but what I mean by that is sometimes when you think of a whale, you traditionally think of a top-down enterprise sales process where there's um, POCs or beta, like agreements. There's data security, vendor analysis. But sometimes if you really have nailed a product need enough, you'll sometimes have senior people that'll just say F it and just skip the whole process and basically sign a deal without even going through legal. That's pretty awesome when it happens. And in that case, you'll see a quote unquote whale acting like a minnow. So even though that person is from a quote unquote whale, a bigger company, they're acting like a minnow or small tuna in the sense that they're making a decision very fast with minimal evaluations and just going right into production.
Cool. I think we
Any
can
other?
keep, and then we'll come back to some of these questions if you don't get to them in the next slides.
Sure. Sounds good. Okay, so understand the underlying economics of the product. Okay, so during ZERP times, no one cared. And if you spent $5 to get $1 in revenue, no one cared. That is not the case anymore. I think, in the past, it was companies were valued primarily just on growth. And to some extent, we're finding in AI that growth is still the primary metric for how people are evaluating things, with the assumption that delivery costs, GPU costs will go down over time for AI. But I definitely think you're way ahead of the game, both in terms of scaling the company, understanding your delivery economics, and also preparing yourself for successive rounds. The earlier you start to think about the economics of how you're delivering your product or service, and some kind of real good shortcuts there are one, you want to build out a financial model. Two, we actually built out a pricing worksheet, and you can kind of see this here, but this is actually a pricing worksheet that we put together on a machine vision product for Backbone, where we literally actually would use this model to do dynamic, to kind of negotiate on prices. And essentially, what we would do is, as a customer is trying to push us down on price, we would shift in terms of what the commitments were around quality QAing of the AI. So as we shifted down in price, we could actually maintain constant margins, and this enabled us to go through negotiations in a really intelligent manner. I will say I once had a session with a really exceptional founder who will remain nameless, who said to me, hey, I know how to code. I've been coding since I was 10. I could build a financial model, no problem. It didn't really end up very well for him. And so I would strongly advise founders, especially if you haven't built a model before, don't try to do it yourself. It is not a good use of your time. If you're trying to maximize the success of your company, you're much better off spending time talking to customers and building product, and working with outside experts on things like financial models. I'm going to put in a plug for my friend Diego. We've now done, I think, 3 companies together. Diego works with Berkman Associates. He's actually also previously McKinsey. He is an absolutely incredible advisor to have. Great at not just building models mechanically, but also really helping early stage founders think through the economics of their business. So a strong endorsement for Diego. And I see that you're also on the call today.
Yeah, Rob, quick question on that. That is to prove ROI to the customer or for yourself just internally as the vendor?
So great question. And I would say this is to understand the economics internally. I'm really mixed. I'm going to say something a little bit spicy here. I am really mixed on ROI. You'll hear, especially from investors, build ROI models, use them in sales. And sometimes you see that work, especially in red ocean situations. But I got to tell you, I mean, I've built probably hundreds of ROI models personally working with AEs, and I can't think of a single time where a customer bought because of an ROI model. It's usually a red herring. It's kind of honestly something you have to do. You can't say no to an ROI model. But typically, when a vendor is putting together the model, typically customers think it's bullshit anyway. And so I think you can definitely, uh, things that work better than ROI models, in my opinion, are case studies. So if you can show companies you've worked with before where your software has been valuable and you can actually share some of the figures, even if you do so anonymously, in my opinion, that is way more powerful than building ROI models. Okay, uh, pricing page. So this is a really important one. So one of the best ways to find out what the features are for software product is to go to the pricing page. In my opinion, typically product pages are kind of useless, fluffy marketing language that don't really tell you much about the actual product. I've spent years and years kind of leading the building of websites for companies I've scaled. And usually when you go look at competitors' websites, the product and solution sections of their websites are total marketing BS. So what I will typically tell people to do is go to the pricing page, because many times that's where you actually list the key features. What people don't sometimes realize is that you can actually use how you list features as a way to kind of frame the conversation about what is important. So as an example, when in the early days of when we were scaling customer, we were directly being compared right out of the gate with Zendesk. Zendesk had been around for a really long time, in many ways a great company. They had a list of hundreds and hundreds of features. And as a new company, there was no way we were going to be able to get to cover these hundreds and hundreds of features. So in the very early days, the Zendesk sales reps were running circles around us by essentially saying like, oh, here's a list of 30 features the customer doesn't have that Zendesk has. And that was tough. Like that kind of cheesy saying, if you don't like what people are saying about you, change the conversation. So we spent a lot of time internally talking about how we could change the conversation. And what we really did is hit on the fact that the nature of support reps, especially in DTC, had changed. And there was less of a focus on a bunch of these kind of obscure corner case features. And there's a lot more focus on things like agent productivity, workflow, and automation, all features that were powered by AI. And customer was incredible at this. And we absolutely crushed Zendesk at that time in these features. So what do? We listed them first on the pricing page. And that made for suddenly very awkward conversations for Zendesk reps. Because what we would do is we would go into a customer call and we'd say, hey, look, here's what's really important. Automation, here's why it's important. Agent productivity, here's why it's important. Here's how we improve the lives of support agents. And so we would frame what was really most important through the pricing page. And then we would send them off to go talk to Zendesk. And we completely turned the tables on Zendesk and head-to-heads and started really crushing them in head-to-heads. LTV CAC, this is, I would say, maybe a little bit dated, and a lot of people think that LTV CAC is BS and don't use it. I disagree. I think it's a helpful exercise you should go through, and someone especially with the financial background like Diego, can really help you go through it. This basically means the long-term value of a customer, how much they generate revenue-wise, and how long they will typically stay on with you before they churn over the customer acquisition cost. A simple way of looking at this is basically the more a customer pays you and the longer they stay with you, the more that you can spend on acquiring them. This was actually a really pivotal moment for us at several companies I've been at, where especially a customer where we were doing rip and replaces off of Zendesk. And what we realized is typically people didn't replace their software, their support software that much. And so what we realized is without changing the economics of pricing delivery, we could spend quite a bit on acquiring customers. And for us, that meant offering a lot of free data migration and setup services, which we offered for free, not part of the pricing, because we knew that once we had a new customer locked in, they would stay with us for a long time. I'm realizing that I haven't covered this elsewhere in the deck, so I'll just mention briefly. There's two kind of primary, and to oversimplify, there's two primary buckets of revenue: software revenue and services revenue. investors really like software revenue. Most investors don't really care about services revenue. There's a whole bunch of reasons for this. Software revenue is higher margin and more repeatable and locked in for the long time. Services revenue is more sporadic and much lower margin. So if you're trying to give a price discount for a customer that you're trying to close, always try to give discounts on the services part of the revenue first, because investors care a lot less about it than they do about the software revenue.
Rob,
Which kind of leads, oh,
is there
yeah.
a gold standard LTV CAC ratio that people should be looking for?
Yes, there is, but that's a whole nother topic of discussion. And I would say that is probably something that is best covered, I would say, in a separate session, because there's a lot of, you start to get into how you want to measure the different components of LTV CAC. But I would say definitely you want LTV CAC definitely above one. Like if your LTV CAC is below one, that means you're you're spending more than the long-term value of a customer. I've seen pretty incredible companies in the 5 to 10 LTV to CAC ratio.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Okay, so this is a really cheesy slide, but it's also really, really effective. So how you actually show pricing, not just on your pages, but also in the agreements that you send over to customers, is really important. Everybody wants to feel like they've gotten a deal. So, and I'm almost ashamed to be talking about this, but it's really effective. So I will typically do a lot of marking up what I would call the list price, and that gives people a sense of what the anchor price is for a product, software product or service, and then you discount it. And what I will typically then do is, over the course of a negotiation, you might, depending on where you're at as a company, how much you want the customer, where you are in a company's development, you will do more discounting. So if you're early stage and you're trying to get your first 10 customers, you can probably discount a ton. And then over time, discount not so much. So in the early days of starting companies, I mean, I'm ashamed to say I've done 50 to 70% discounts off list price. But then that kind of essentially floats upwards towards to the point where once a company is more kind of mid to later stage, to get anything more than a 5 to 10% discount off list price requires like a VP level approval or above. But actually, although cheesy, this is also really effective. One, it turns the buyer that you're negotiating with into a hero, because they're able to kind of pound the table internally and show that they've actually gotten a bunch of discounts. And then two, it positions you really well for land and expand. I've done this a ton at every company I've been at. What you'll find is year one, investors don't care nearly as much about how you're doing revenue wise. What they care about is the trend graph over time. So put simply, the lower you start your revenue in year one, and the more you set yourself up for expansion, the better you do. I've seen a bunch of companies get absolutely insanely high valuations as they go into their Series A and their Series B post seed by using this technique a lot. So discounting, but then anchoring. So you could, for example, in this case of this customer, show that you could say essentially, look, this is a $60,000 sort of license agreement. We really want to do the business with you, so we're going to give you a huge discount. But we're only going to do the agreement for 1 year. And this works especially well if your product is amazing. Substitutes aren't that great, and there's a lot of lock-in. And then once you go into year two, if people are loving your product, they're not going to care about migrating towards list price, or maybe you negotiate a lower discount and you converge towards that list price. So you're able to do some very powerful land and expand over time. I'm going to pause. Questions?
Yeah, Rob, have you ever had to deal with an unhappy customer who learned that someone else got a much better discount on your product than they were getting?
Wow. Yes, a lot, but less than you would think. And I think probably what the person's really asking is, what do you do in those situations? I would say that the first line of defense is to have a consistent structure of pricing where if you're going to offer discounts, you get some value in exchange. And so some typical values in exchange would be to, give them like quote unquote strategic customer status, where they agree to collaborate with you on marketing. You can just give a customer a ton of discounts, um, but you're always better off if it's tied to some sort of a reason. Either they were an early lead adopter customer, or they have agreed to be a strategic customer, which can have a whole bunch of actually meaningful things associated with it, like co-marketing, doing a case study, providing quotes for marketing materials, etc. So the first line of defense is there's a really good reason for why you offered them that pricing that is better than somebody that might be coming to you. Um, I think about overall the hundreds and hundreds of deals that I've worked on, and the very few, the times that people have complained about pricing, that is typically good enough. Um, if not, there are other ways you can offer them, maybe some make goods. Like a good example would be to offer them some services, some implementation services, migration services. Maybe it's the acceleration of a data integration that they weren't expecting for a few quarters, and you agree to do it upfront. I found that services gives are a great way to keep customers happy in a tough situation, partly because VCs don't care about that so much, and partly because what they're typically comparing the services that you're offering to are companies like Accenture that massively, massively mark up their services. So by comparison, they will view the services that you're providing them as being more value. And I would say kind of a last line of defense is to offer a make good if that is absolutely necessary to not losing the customer.
Yeah, and just another scenario someone's bringing up. They've seen that sometimes when you discount a customer in year one, you're going to have a very hard time getting them to list again in year two. Have you seen that? And then how do you normally handle that?
I think it really depends on how valuable your product is. The more valuable and differentiated your product is, um, the harder it's going to be to mark it up. And I think lock-in is a really important part too. So if it's easy to switch off your product and your product's not that differentiated, it's a good point. It may be harder to do that land and expansion of pricing. But I would argue that if you don't have any pricing power with a customer that's been with you for a year, you've got bigger problems.
Gotcha. Okay, I think we can move on to the next slide.
Okay. Okay, so pricing, iteration speed. Yes, so I think I talked about this earlier, but wanted to make sure I threw this in here. Learning is extremely important. Talk to a ton of customers early stage about pricing. I would say that True AI is the first time that we have been as methodical as this on testing price demand curves. It helped that when I joined, João, who's the CEO and original founder, has done just an absolutely incredible job at marketing the company. First built out an open source framework for building and deploying agents, and has been very active on social media. So by the time I joined, we had a wait list for our enterprise product. It was kind of a layer on top of open source, a wait list of over 10,000 companies. So with the wait list of 10,000, I viewed it as an opportunity to get extremely precise data about the demand curve. So using Crew AI's, we sort of built and deployed a bunch of crews internally to facilitate and automate a bunch of our CRM and sales related processes. And one of them was qualifying and setting up meetings. So what we did is we kind of did an email blast to thousands and thousands of folks from the wait list and invited them to fill out a survey. We qualified them. And between Typeform online and then, calls, we actually ended up setting up, I think about probably 200 customer calls in the first 4 weeks, 15 to 20 minutes. And one of many things that we covered was literally looking at pricing. And we got some very valuable lessons here. So the pricing you're seeing here isn't necessarily the pricing we're going to be rolling out. But we were able to get extremely precise look at what customers were willing to pay initially, what they're willing to pay over time, if the products worked the way they expected them to, and how people wanted to pay as well.
Yeah, this might be a good point or yeah, good point to talk about someone else's question. How do you approach pricing regarding converting free pilots to paid pilots across, minnows, tunas, whales?
I hate pilots, is the short answer. I would say that, let's see. Yes, perfect. I hate pilots. I love auto flips. So if you want to call them pilots or POCs, um, anything that is kind of a standalone agreement, and sometimes, especially with whales, they will absolutely require that to do business with them. So there are cases where you have to do pilots or POCs. I hate them because you're essentially having to sell to the same customer twice. And so what I will typically prefer to do wherever possible, this works, I would say almost 100% of the time with tunas. And I would say maybe initially 50%, but probably closer to 80%. And once you've gotten going with whales, I personally would not recommend ever doing pilots with minnows. Instead, what I suggest are what is kind of sort of clumsily laid out here is an auto flip, which is essentially you do a trial period, which is either discounted or free. And then if they don't provide notice, then it automatically flips into a paying customer agreement. Now, I personally never want a customer to feel trapped in an agreement. And even with an auto flip, if somebody kind of forgot to give notice and then it auto flipped into a paying relationship, if the customer is pissed and really didn't want to use the product, I wouldn't force them to stay locked in the agreement. But by doing an auto flip, it kind of forces people to be much more disciplined about agreeing to a quote unquote pilot or test period, which will automatically flip into a paying agreement. And so I've definitely seen some customers, especially tunas, reject an auto flip. And in my opinion, they just weren't a serious customer to begin with. Does that answer the question?
Okay.
Kira, any other questions or should I continue?
If you can keep going, and we'll get to some of the more miscellaneous ones at the end.
Okay, great. So 10, never underestimate what your customers are going to pay once they trust you. So this is one of my favorite pricing stories. Again, also from customer. This is back from a long time ago, 2017. So in the time I was with customer, we launched the product. Things were going really well. We'd closed the first 50 or 60 customers. We had a set of price tiers. And one of the things I noticed was at the time, something like half of the customers we were signing were actually signing at the top price tier. And so, kind of half joking one time over lunch with the CEO, Brad, who's an incredible CEO, by the way. We were kind of joking. I said, this is crazy. Like, we have all these customers that are signing up for our top tier. I don't know. Maybe we're underpricing. And then we kind of joked. We were like, yeah, let's come up with a tier that's like insane. It's really expensive. And like, let's add a bunch of fluffy, meaningful stuff, but actually there's a lot more around things like services. So I think at the time we came up with a tier that was called, I think, Ultimate or the King tier, just something absolutely ridiculously stupid. I mean, it was almost a joke. It was like, I think 30 to 40% more than our current highest tier. And by the next quarter, something like a third of the customers that were signing up for that highest tier. And we had quite a few laughs after that. And we spent a huge amount of time ensuring that top tier that we'd rolled out really did deliver truly meaningful, valuable service and value for our customers. In retrospect, it wasn't that crazy an idea because if you think about it, these were companies that were paying a software license for a product that their support team was using, 8 to 10 hours a day, every day. So, essentially, if you looked at the incremental cost per hour for these support people of having the slightly higher tier, it was really nothing. And then if you looked at the value that a higher tier could provide, it was actually, in retrospect, a really good deal. So I guess the joke was on us. But I guess I've hosted pricing sessions before. And I think a quote that came out of some of these pricing sessions was the idea that pricing is not a monolith. So pricing should be fluid, dynamic. You should constantly be iterating on pricing. It can have an enormous impact on your company's revenues, your company's profits, and is an absolutely effective way. In my opinion, it is one of the single most effective ways to really learn what your customers actually truly care about is what they're willing to actually pay for.
Yeah, Rob, this is an interesting question that I've actually never thought about before. But how do you approach pricing across different countries that might be at different economic development levels? So kind of globalization of pricing.
Yes. I will say, I think early on, you want to make sure the pricing. Yeah, I think early on in a company's evolution, speed is your friend and friction and complexity are your enemies. So early on, I would suggest, I would recommend against having prices for different countries because that creates a huge layer of complexity. And I will say that if your product's delivering enough value, you're not going to see a lot of pushback from an economic perspective. I can tell you, for example, Crew, we talked to 200 plus customers in the first, sort of month. And I don't know, it was maybe 30 or 40 countries represented. And I saw very little variability on price sensitivity for different countries. There was maybe a few of them, a few countries in Africa and in Asia, but generally speaking, people were much less sensitive on price than we would have expected given the value they expected to get from the product. What you can probably do is, perhaps offer a free tier or a lower price tier that can satisfy folks from lower per capita income countries. But what I would say is that, in my opinion, having a lot of lead adopter customers that are price sensitive isn't necessarily just tied to geography. It may be tied to a whole bunch of things. So, for example, right now with Crew, we've definitely seen some folks that are maybe a little bit more price sensitive, but it doesn't really have to do so much with geos. A lot of times it'll have to do with whether somebody is like an individual developer working from their dorm room or somebody working at a big company. So I do think that, especially if you're going into a blue ocean kind of new market, I think it's really important to lower the threshold and kind of democratize access to your product over time. And there's a ton of different ways of doing that. And for example, one great way that I've seen a lot of people address this is having an open source layer. And so some of my favorite companies that have launched, including us, have an open source layer. And that's a great way to provide some powerful tools, community, and a product that iterates over time that can satisfy the needs of folks that are more price sensitive. Questions?
Think, let me see where we are. Yeah, maybe keep going and then we'll round back to a few.
Okay, we have just a few slides left. So continuing on, I put this rather ugly kind of bingo sheet together. This is basically mostly just to give folks an idea that for every single category of how you're thinking about pricing, there's a bunch of different options. And this is just kind of this is just meant to be a kind of a way to show people that there may be a bunch of different options that you haven't thought of for things like POCs if you're going to be forced into doing them, et cetera. I personally have my particular preference, but it's kind of a great, very structured way to go through your options, between co-founders or between the co-founder folks and the growth folks and the go-to-market folks. So pricing, as I kind of mentioned, there's a bunch of different ways that you can do pricing. I will say that at several companies I've been at, I've typically worked with technical founders and co-founders that absolutely love usage pricing. I will say that developers are some of the hardest people to sell to because they're both extremely smart and extremely price sensitive. The easiest way to make money is to sell to folks that aren't maybe as sharp as developers and are pricing sensitive. I won't mention who I'm thinking of, but a lot of times, especially in the early stages of a company, especially for folks that want to just sell to individual developers. You'll hear per user pricing or usage-based pricing. I personally don't like those options nearly as much as tiered pricing or what I call buckets, which if you'll go to pretty much any SaaS product is typically how people do pricing. I have noticed in AI, there does seem to be a lot more, at least at this stage, especially at the LLM layer, more usage-based pricing. I personally like tiers for a whole bunch of reasons. Price discrimination, it makes it easier to forecast. I think probably I'm not gonna read the list here because you can, but I think one particular thing that is one of the very attractive components of tiered pricing is the fact that you get what it's called breakage. So obviously, the same concept holds true for your mobile phone and for other things. And that's the idea that, when somebody is a buyer and they buy something, let's say for $100, they kind of think that when they evaluate the value that they're paying for, they think of, oh, let's say, they're going to get, 1,000 units per month for $100. They never use exactly 1,000 units. It's usually some small fraction of that. And what that means is you're actually getting breakage. So you're actually essentially selling some capacity that is not actually being used. And that then in turn can actually boost your margins, which is why a lot of SaaS companies that are really smart about their pricing have relatively higher gross margins in the kind of 60 to 80% range. Now, that time may be coming to an end. And I think Chamath and Dave Sachs has certainly talked about this on the All In podcast, is the idea that basically AI is making it really easy, especially if you're using agents from platforms like Crew, to build your own applications internally that do a lot of the functions of SaaS and more. And so I'll just provide a caution in general for SaaS companies and about over optimizing and having your gross margins be too big. I think Jeff Bezos and Amazon once said that your profit, or I think it was your profit, is my opportunity. And I think the same is true here. You definitely want to have fat gross margins. You definitely want to make sure you do pricing right. But if you get too greedy, especially in the early stages of a company, that can create an opportunity for other companies. So think about your profit margins, and tiers can certainly help that. But at the same time, don't get too greedy.
Yeah, Rob, I want to make sure we get to this question because I think it's kind of the sentiment in a few different questions. How do you approach pricing if you're completely unknown and early stage and this is really your first customer that you're selling to? So you don't want to lowball yourself at future renewals.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I think the short answer is throw a lot of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And some good ways to do this. I think what I'm hearing is, how do you socially engineer engaging with your first 5 to 10 customers on pricing when you haven't done pricing before? And I would say, put simply, one, and I know this is going to sound crazy, build a personal relationship first. One of the biggest mistakes I see early stage companies make with their initial customers is they make the relationship overly transactional. Your product doesn't work perfectly, especially in the early stages of a company, and they're kind of taking a risk on you. And so building a personal relationship with them is really important. That doesn't necessarily mean grabbing beers every night. It can mean deeply understanding your buyer, their business, what they're trying to do with their product, what keeps them up at night, things like that. So one, build that personal relationship with the customer, deeply understand them and what their needs are. I think another one is understand the value that your product can provide. I think a very easy kind of component is how, for example, for AI, is how AI will save people's time. So that's a way to quantify. And then I think another sort of tactic you can use is to look at other software products that a company has bought and kind of, compare against that. But, honestly, at the end of the day, a lot of it is just talking to a lot of customers, start with friendlies, and then just workshop pricing. And I think at the end of the day, in all the years I've been building companies, there's no substitute for just going and talking to a few hundred folks and literally trying stuff out. I think things have been easier and more clear for us at Crew, especially given the wait list. But at other companies I've been at, I mean, we've literally just kind of gone and said like, hey, here's what we're thinking about pricing. What do you think? And I've been really surprised at how genuine and helpful people are from the customer side when you just ask for their opinion. And then, you can say things like, hey, look, here's what I'm thinking about pricing. Does this sound good? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? And you can hear what they say, read their body language. And I think once you've had 5 to 10 of those kind of conversations, you could typically have a pretty good sense for where your initial pricing should start. And then as your company gets more well known and your product gets more proven, you can typically kind of increase price over time, especially by adding features to tiers. Um, and then I've definitely had it where I've been working with teams where we're like, God, we're kind of underpricing. Let's start to scale up. You start scaling up the pricing, kind of like we did at Customer. But we've also made mistakes where we've gone too high on prices. And the good news is the customers will tell you pretty directly that you've gone too high. So it's sort of almost like a dynamic, throw a lot of stuff out there, see what people respond to, and then you'll get a pretty clear idea where you're going to land.
Well, and then this is a pretty specific question on your last slide. I believe it's about POCs for the tunas and whales. Just getting more in depth on what that credit means.
Oh,
Oh, sorry, slide 15. It's your pricing decision bingo sheet.
okay, here you go. Okay, so credits. Yeah, I think there's a bunch of ways of doing this. Where, for example, if people are going to pay for POCs, and again, I hate POCs, but if people are going to do it, then I have seen situations. Honestly, I've probably been more on the buy side of this, where people might pay for the POC, but then if you pay for the POC and it's successful, they will either get the amount that they paid for the POC for the test will then be credited to their overall amount that they will pay for year one, for example. I just included this as an option. It's not something that's particularly common in my opinion. Typically, the way POCs work is if they're going to happen, you're typically paying some small amount that's just enough that they feel like it's important, and but not big enough that it creates an over amount of friction or approvals. By the way, I didn't say this. I've only got 4 minutes left. Something else that's another really important hack is and I said this, at a conceptual level in one of the previous slides, deeply understand your customers and price points for approvals. So for example, I've definitely seen scenarios where, you start to talk to companies and they'll say things like, oh yeah, for marketing software approvals over 5K, it needs to go to a VP. And so you basically can find some ways of structuring the pricing so that you sail in under VP approval levels. So I think the more you can ask a customer about the approval process of how something works, and here's something that's really important, ask them what has been approved in the past. Like, what pricing has worked with you guys in the past? What pricing didn't work with you guys in the past? How did it get approved? What was the problem with it? Did someone get promoted? So the more you can understand about the buyer's approval process and authorization levels, the faster and smarter you'll be able to move.
Well, with 2 minutes left, I think we can end there. And Rob, you got through pretty much every single question in the chat, I'm pretty sure. So I know you just have like one more slide with a few photos on it, and then I can kind of do my outro from there.
Great. I'll be super quick. So pricing, kind of a funny anecdote to end up. I actually was invited by Boldstar to give a talk on pricing back in March in Miami. And as a result that you can kind of see over in the corner is Joao, was the CEO of Crew. We ended up connecting, and 3 months later, you'll see on the right, we got a verbal on a massive customer deal with a $500 billion fund for them to use at Crew AI. So pricing was how he and I first got to know each other. And I feel like, thanks to the 200 plus customers we talked to in month one, we really nailed our pricing and has enabled us to close really big customer deals quickly. I'll just say finally, thank you all so much for being a part of this session. And I want to give another shout out and thank you to Workbench. You guys are amazing. Deeply grateful for what you do for the ecosystem. You can reach me on Twitter at RMB. also on LinkedIn. I love helping founders in my spare time. So anybody that has any questions that didn't get covered today, feel free to DM me on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'd be happy to help you.
And Rob, if you could just hit next slide real fast. Yes, so thank you so much to Rob and everyone who joined us for this masterclass. We will be posting this recording online, so look out for that. And then, like Rob said, make sure to follow him on LinkedIn and Twitter. And just again, if you are a pre-seed or seed stage enterprise startup and want to chat through anything go-to-market, definitely reach out to the team at Workbench. And if you're looking for more tactical content, visit our blog. And we actually do have another masterclass coming up with Kyle Poyer, the operating partner at OpenView, on all things marketing hacks. Let me post that in the channel real fast. So you can sign up for that with that link in the chat. And I think that's it. We did it. Cool. Thanks so much, Rob, and hope to see everyone else on a future webinar. Bye, everyone.